Good afternoon and welcome to this ECML webinar entitled COVID-19 and Language Education, Two Challenges, One Response. The last webinar in 2020 offered by the ECML as additional support to the languages community during this period of crisis. My name is Sarah Breslin and I'm the Executive Director of the European Centre for Modern Languages of the Council of Europe. For those of you who don't know the ECML, it is an enlarged partial agreement with 33 member states from across geographic Europe, and the only centre of its kind dedicated to language education. Our mission is to support member states implement language policies and practices based on the fundamental values of the Council of Europe: democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. We do this through 4-year programmes of development projects, the creation of innovative resources to address burning needs in member states, across a range of themes such as early language learning, digital literacy, adult migrants in the workplace, or sign languages, and also through mediation, through working at local, regional, or national level to ensure that resources from successful projects are adapted and contextualised to meet needs on the ground. I'm delighted to see that just as with previous webinars, we had one for language teachers, Take Your Language Teaching Online, and another for head teachers, inspectors and curriculum developers, how to ensure that languages flourish in your school. This one today is directed at decision makers in language education, and like the others, has attracted a huge amount of interest. Just over 450 people from 49 different countries from Europe and further afield registered to watch the webinar. And as a result, we're now streaming it live through YouTube so that other people can follow in their own time. Our speaker today is David Little, whom I'm sure many of you know. David is Fellow Emeritus of Trinity College, Dublin. He has been actively involved in the Council of Europe's work in language education since the 1980s, with a particular focus on the European language portfolio, the linguistic integration of adult migrants, and the teaching and learning of Romani. Between 2004 and 2011, he coordinated 2 ECML projects on the European language portfolio, and he currently coordinates the ECML's QualiRom training and consultancy. He wrote one of the preparatory studies for the CEFR on strategic competence and was a member of a Council of Europe working group that advised on the development of the companion volume. His principal research interests are language learner autonomy and plurilingual education at primary level. I would like to take this opportunity to thank David for offering to deliver this webinar, and I'm sure you, like I am, are looking forward very much to his presentation. Just a few practical points before we begin. Given the number of participants, it's not possible to allow you to take the floor to ask any questions or make comments. However, we have built in time for comments and questions at the end, so please use the chat function for this. We have indicated an overall time of 45 minutes, but this of course can be extended depending on the number of questions. Although David's input will be in English, you can write your questions or comments in English, French, German or Spanish. My colleague Catherine Zewald will answer any questions she can right away if you're looking for a link to a resource, for example. She will also collate the questions so that I can put them to David on your behalf at the end following his intervention. So without further ado, I now hand over to David Little. David, please.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and greetings from Dublin, where it's rather cold and very damp. Let me share my screen with you. COVID-19 and language education, 2 challenges, 1 response. I'm not going to offer you a quick fix, but rather some reflections about long-term developments I think COVID suggests we might undertake. And as you'll see, I'm going to suggest that our way into the future includes a small journey back into the past. Even with the development of vaccines, about which there's currently a great deal of excitement, no one knows when the world will find a solution to the COVID-19 problem. No one knows if we shall ever return to what we thought of as normal life. So it's not too soon to confront the educational challenges that COVID-19 has brought and search for effective responses. We've already had evidence enough that hoping that things will ease up and improve quickly within 2 or 3 months is not a sensible thing to do. And in any case, we're warned that COVID-19 may be the harbinger of further pandemics, which might strike us at greater frequency in the future than in the past. The purpose of the webinar is to outline a single integrated response to 2 challenges that COVID-19 has brought to language education. These challenges have been identified by members of the Council of Europe's Standing Committee for Education Policy and Practice and the Governing Board of the ECML. And they are public examinations and distance learning. Let me say a little more about them. First of all, public examinations. The widespread cancellation of public exams last summer threw education systems into chaos. And we quickly discovered that algorithms, however sophisticated, are no substitute for student performance. When school grades, teachers' assessed results were submitted to examining authorities, they were then adjusted. They were adjusted according to such criteria as the individual school's previous performance in public exams, and they were also adjusted in order to massage the total student population into the bell-shaped curve which our education systems still kneel before. But what happened, of course, was that students and parents were outraged to discover that prospective grades that had been submitted in good faith were then subject to this kind of manipulation. And the outrage was so great that authorities were obliged in a number of countries, including my own, to accept whatever grades had been sent in by schools, teachers, and to go ahead on that basis. It is a fact, of course, that in most education systems, the grades that teachers give for language exams can't be translated into a summary description of students' proficiency. If my neighbor tells me that his daughter has just got such and such a grade in the school leaving exam for German, all I know is that within our system of grading, she's done very well or reasonably well or not so well or not well at all. I can't understand from her grade what skills she may have in German, what kind of linguistic profile she's achieved. And with that in mind, we have to say that when reliance of teacher grades leads to grade inflation, as happened last summer, this is the fault of the system, not of teachers. Because what teachers are obliged to do in this kind of system is guess. They have to guess how this student and that student and the other student will perform in an exam which is related to the curriculum, but which is, in the end, going to be norm-referenced in terms of the results. It isn't a criterion-governed system. And then the challenge of distance learning. Effective distance learning requires a great deal more than a reliable laptop, a stable internet connection, and a quiet room. Very early in our respective lockdowns, we've discovered that those three things may be, for many households, extremely difficult to secure. But even when they can be secured, to what extent are our students capable of being autonomous learners, regardless of their age or the stage they've reached in their education? How effectively do we help them to develop skills of self-management? Are we providing them with appropriate tools? And as they manage their own learning, how effectively are they able to monitor their own progress in relation to curriculum goals? It seems to me that the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages, published back in 2001, together with its companion volume published in the definitive version earlier this year, provide us with a means of responding to these two challenges. At the level of policy, the CEFR's proficiency levels and illustrative scales allow us to bring curriculum, teaching, learning, and assessment into closer alignment with one another than is usually the case. Because each can-do statement can be used simultaneously to specify a learning outcome, provide a learning focus, and imply an assessment task. The CEFR, in other words, is preeminently an instrument of constructive alignment. That's to say, bringing curriculum, teaching, learning, and assessment into this close interactive relationship. And because can-do descriptors focus on behavior rather than knowledge, learners themselves can participate in the new assessment culture that these considerations imply. On the level of practice, all Council of Europe education projects aim to help develop the individual citizen's ability to participate critically and proactively in the democratic process. It's no accident that it was the Council of Europe that first introduced the concept of learner autonomy to language education via Henri Olek's report, Autonomy and Foreign Language Learning. And the language user learner described by the CEFR and the companion volume is autonomous by definition. The CEFR defines the language user learner as a social agent who has tasks to perform. Now, agency is the capacity to make choices, take decisions on the basis of those choices, carry the decisions through in a series of actions, monitoring the progress of those actions, and then when the actions have come to a conclusion, to evaluate the results. And that is what Henri Olek defines as autonomy when it's applied to learning. Also, of course, can do, which is at the heart of the descriptive scheme of the CEFR, is the basis of self-management, the essence of autonomy. And the European language portfolio was conceived as, among other things, a means of fostering learner autonomy. So let me say a little more about the European language portfolio. It was developed to mediate the ethos of the CEFR and the values of the Council of Europe to language user learners. In other words, its purpose is to encourage and support the development of learner autonomy, the fostering of intercultural awareness and intercultural learning, and the development of plurilingualism, understood as an integrated language proficiency comprising 2 or more languages. The ELP was designed to familiarize language user learners with the CEFR's action-oriented definition of language proficiency. Each ELP is provided with checklists of I can descriptors, derived of course from can do descriptors, and ELP users use them to identify learning targets and evaluate learning outcomes. Now, goal setting and self-assessment are the bedrock of reflective autonomous learning. A brief history, and if you're interested in filling out the very skeletal framework I'm going to provide, then go to the Council of Europe's ELP website. The URL is on the screen now, and you'll find more information than you would ever imagine you'd need. In 1997, the Council of Europe introduced the concept of the ELP, along with the second draft of the CEFR, at an intergovernmental conference in Strasbourg. From 1998 to 2000, ELP pilot projects were carried out in 15 Council of Europe member states and by 4 international non-government organizations. And over those 3 years, project leaders came together at 6 monthly intervals hosted by a succession of member states in order to report to one another on their progress and to consider how to respond to whatever challenges had arisen. From 2000 to 2009, the design of further ELPs and their implementation was supported by a series of 8 European seminars, again hosted by different member states. From 2000 to 2010, the Council of Europe's ELP Validation Committee validated and accredited 118 ELPs from 33 member states and 6 international non-government organizations. Validation came to an end in 2010, but from 2011 to 2014, 23 further ELPs were registered by the Council of Europe on the basis of self-declaration. From the beginning, there were quite serious obstacles to widespread use of the ELP. ELP development was rarely part of a larger reform of curricula and assessment. And that meant that there was often a mismatch between curriculum goals and the I can descriptors in the ELP checklists. This was a problem for teachers, but also for learners. Official support for ELP implementation rarely continued beyond pilot projects. The ELP's focus on learner autonomy was often in conflict with dominant teaching methods. ELP models were often too heavy. They seemed to include everything that their developers had ever thought or read about language learning and teaching. And that brought them into conflict with textbooks. And in that conflict, only textbooks were likely to win, because in many countries, teachers are obliged to use a textbook, often one that has official approval. Also, self-assessment, on which successful ELP use depends, was alien to most national education systems and teachers. During the pilot projects, self-assessment was the thing that project leaders most frequently reported teachers found difficult to manage when they were introducing the ELP to their students. And these obstacles help to explain why it is that, although it was greeted by much enthusiasm when it was first introduced to language education across Europe in 2001, the ELP has not established itself as an indispensable and widespread tool supporting language learning in any Council of Europe member states. And yet, the pedagogical ambitions of the CEFR companion volume require a renewed focus on the three goals of the ELP: learner autonomy, intercultural awareness and intercultural learning, and plurilingualism. It's true, I think, that most national curricula include critical thinking and learner autonomy among their key objectives, though they may not use those terms. It's certainly the case that universities routinely claim to develop their students' capacity for critical thinking. And it seems to me that the goals and spirit of the ELP should play a central role in our response to the challenges of COVID-19. So let me now outline for you the response I think we should make to these twin challenges posed by COVID-19. I'm going to do this necessarily rather briefly and very schematically, but I hope nevertheless that as I gradually build up this screen, you'll see where it's leading. Let me start at the level of policy, by which I mean curriculum. I'm going to talk here about three things we need to do at policy level, and I necessarily have to talk about them one at a time. But in the process that I'm describing with this blue box, these three things are interdependent and form a sort of recursive cycle of gradual progress. And the first thing is to state or restate communicative curriculum goals in can-do terms, and to summarize this statement as a learner profile. The companion volume offers us this example of that exercise. The authors of the companion volume have drawn up this fictional profile of needs in an additional language for a program in CLIL, content and language integrated learning, at lower secondary. So what this profile represents is the target repertoire for learners who will have followed a program of 3 or 4 years, and will be completing that program at the age of 15 or 16. Now you can see from the 4 blue bits of the diagram that the profile embraces the 4 modes of communication which are the basis of the CEFR's descriptive scheme: reception, interaction, production, and mediation. In developing the profile, the authors have gone through the illustrative scales for each of those modes and identified those scales that are relevant to the needs of the learners in question. So for reception, we have the scales: understanding conversation between other speakers, understanding audio or signed media recordings, watching TV, film and video, reading for information and argument, reading instructions, reading as a leisure activity. And so it goes on round the circle for interaction, production, and mediation. The proficiency levels involved here are A1, which is never an exit level, A2, which is for some activities, and then B1 and B2. And the intermediate circles among these concentric circles allow for plus levels. You can see that this profile is uneven. In other words, in achieving the communicative repertoire that this curriculum requires, learners are more advanced in some areas of communicative behavior than in others. Now, the profile, as I've said, is drawn by looking at these illustrative scales, and for each scale identifying the descriptor which most appropriately captures the level that we want learners to achieve by the end of their program. And it should go without saying that all the descriptors below that particular one encompass the gradually developing proficiency in relation to that particular scale, its activities, that learners have to develop starting at the beginning. We then need to develop checklists of I can descriptors, deriving them by reformulating, in some cases dividing, in other cases simplifying the descriptors from the illustrative scales on which we've based our profile. And those checklists are a way of capturing the learning trajectory of the curriculum, and they should support detailed record keeping by teachers. When the program in question runs over 3 or 4 years, we may want to have overlapping checklists for the different years. And these are instruments by which teachers can plan their work. And of course, they provide them with criteria by which they can judge the progress of their classes as a group of learners, but also the progress of individual learners. Here, in case you haven't ever encountered ELP checklists, is an example of a generic checklist developed by the validation committee for ELPs designed for older adolescents and adults. I can understand what people say to me in simple everyday conversation when they speak slowly and clearly. I can understand everyday words and phrases relating to areas of immediate personal relevance, and so on and so forth. And as you read through those descriptors, you will see overlap in terms of the linguistic material needed, linguistic competences, if you like, in order to perform each of these activities. And when learners use checklists like this to understand the learning trajectory on which they're engaged, the descriptors become components of their emerging communicative identity. Here's another example, B1 spoken production. Look at the first descriptor here. I can give a straightforward description of a subject within my academic or professional field, presenting it as a linear sequence of points. I've chosen this example because I want to remind you that from somewhere in the middle of B1 up through B2 and C1 to C2, we can only understand many of the activities embodied in the descriptors as components of behavior in academic or professional contexts. And of course, when checklists of descriptors are being used to accompany a program of learning, there is a great deal of work to be done by teachers and learners in unpicking the descriptors, exploring what exactly they mean in terms of the curriculum content, and the activities in which learners are engaged. To stay with this first example, what is my academic field or my professional field? And how would we define a straightforward description? How long would it be? What linguistic characteristics would it have? And so on. There are often no simple or unambiguous answers to those questions, but the very fact that they're asked and learners and teachers attempt to answer them sets learning on a reflective path. And then the third thing here is to specify the range of spoken and written texts that we expect learners to work with at the various curriculum levels. And as I said a few minutes ago, these three things are not a sequence, but three parts of a recursive cycle of development. When it comes to public exams, of course, we have to ensure that the exams are an adequate measure of the learning trajectory described by the curriculum, captured by that learner profile. So we shall want to make sure that our examinees are asked to perform tasks that they are used to performing as part of their regular learning, tasks that are integral to their emerging repertoire. We will need to develop rating criteria and scoring schemes that themselves are informed by the repertoire we're aiming at, and behind that, the descriptor checklists. But those rating criteria and scoring schemes need to be shared with schools so that they can be shared with students, because we want to insist on this interdependence of curriculum and assessment. The red arrow is intended to indicate that interdependence. Now, within that kind of framework, at the level of practice, pedagogy, we should always begin by introducing our learners to relevant checklists of I can descriptors. We should, from the very first day, encourage them to think of themselves as learners who are users of their target language, gradually learning to perform these tasks in the checklists, which then become the components of their communicative self-description. We should also engage teachers and learners in the development of tools, learning diaries, logbooks, portfolios, that help them to manage their own learning. This is one of the core ideas of the ELP, but you'll notice that I'm not urging a return to the ELP as it was described in the principles and guidelines and promoted by the validation committee. Early in the history of the validation committee, one of its members, my friend and colleague from Finland, Viljo Koinen, was very firm in arguing that it was really not a good idea pedagogically to impose a heavy structure from outside on classrooms, but rather to give the instruments, the elements of a toolkit to teachers and students, and encourage them to find their own way of documenting the teaching learning process as they gradually move along. And I'm sure that that was right. Those two things perhaps imply this third point, that we should adopt in our classrooms activities that are easy to relate to the checklist descriptors. And we should develop learners' skills of self-assessment. And that, of course, is something that begins with the launching of a reflective approach to teaching and learning based on the checklists. Reflective learning, goal setting, and self-assessment imply a role for alternative modes of assessment in awarding overall grades. There are many forms that alternative modes of assessment can take. We might, for example, have whole classes produce projects that display student skills in speaking, writing, interaction, and mediation. Some of those skills developed collaboratively, others developed and exercised individually. And in rating these alternative assessment instruments, we should adapt the criteria and scoring schemes used in the public exams. Not adapt them in terms of changing their basis, but in terms of the way in which they're used. And we should perhaps establish networks of schools so that if we're concerned that the moderation of students' work within a single institution is too inward turned, then there might be some collaboration between networks of schools in a locality. And here again, what I'm arguing for is an approach to learning that is reflective, engaging pupils, students from the beginning in goal setting and self-assessment, and which is complemented by modes of school-based assessment that are very closely related to the types of learning and learning activity that they engage in. We can then see a tight relation between public exams, and the whole structure is held together because the alternative modes of assessment demonstrably flow from the curriculum and the way in which it's structured, and the public exams are seen to be an appropriate assessment, but also a support for the way in which teaching and learning happens. This scheme, of course, moves away from the bell-shaped curve because it is unapologetically criterion referenced. And the descriptive scheme of the CEFR ensures that the criterion referencing is both detailed and robust. How exactly do I think this is a response to the twin challenges of COVID-19? Well, when COVID-19 returns or something else intervenes to oblige the authorities to cancel public exams, we are not left floundering. We have in place a well-developed alternative system of assessment, and all the issues that we had to do with algorithms and teacher grades and so on and so forth are no longer a terrible public scandal. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is all I have to say. It's over to you. Are these ideas worth exploring further in some kind of collaborative undertaking between institutions or between education systems? And if they are, what would be the way forward? Thank you very much for the attention I assume you've given.
Thank you very much, David. That was really, really interesting. And my colleague Catherine has been collecting quite a number of questions actually for you. So I will just present these to you in the order in which I received them. The first question is about the age of learners participating in this new assessment culture. The question is, from what age do you think learners themselves can participate in the new assessment culture? Do you have evidence-based research for this? So I presume Dina here is talking about your idea of learners being able to assess themselves and their peers, and from what age do you think that is possible?
Well, I think we have to have a fairly broad understanding of assessment. If we do, what I mean by that is thinking about something that I or someone else has done, and then making some evaluative judgment. Then I think the answer is that can be done within the right kind of pedagogical framework from a very early age indeed. In recent years, I've been working very closely with a colleague who used to be principal of a primary school in Dublin West that has found an extraordinarily impressive way of responding to the challenge of linguistic diversity. A school with 300 pupils and 50 home languages. And what they do is to encourage pupils to use their home languages in the classroom. And they do that within a framework of dialogic communication. Dialogic in the sense that although the teacher is in charge, it's clear from the beginning being at the age of about 4.5, that the learners themselves are encouraged to take initiatives. And within that framework, reflective learning begins very early, and children at a relatively unadvanced stage of their linguistic development start to come out with metalinguistic insights that indicate this evaluative capacity in operation. In the heyday of the ELP, we developed a portfolio for use by teachers in our primary schools who were charged with supporting the English language development of pupils from immigrant families, pupils who didn't therefore speak English or Irish at home. And that portfolio had checklists in exactly the way that the principles and guidelines require ELPs to have checklists. And again, teachers found no difficulty in using that with pupils from age 6 upwards. But of course, it wasn't a matter of giving these pupils the checklists and inviting them to assess themselves. It was rather a matter of focusing on the checklists and particular descriptors in them and engaging pupils in collaborative exploration of what it meant to be able to do these things. And that, of course, was beginning to teach them self-assessment. I'm sure you're worried that I could go on about this almost forever, but that I'm assuming that the question was aimed at younger learners.
Thank you very much, David. I have a very practical question, something I should have actually asked you anyway in advance of the webinar, and that is, are you happy for us to share your slides?
Oh, yes, yes.
Excellent, excellent. I have another question, a more technical one. How would you divide B1 levels, B1.1, B1.2? B plus is a bridge between B1 and B2, isn't it? Or is it the same as B1.2?
That's a very good question, and I can't answer it with 100% confidence. But I think B1 plus and B1.2 must be the same thing. I've never been 100% convinced about the division of these levels, the subdivision, especially when that subdivision goes beyond 2 and becomes 3 or 4, because it seems to me that what we're then in danger of doing is confusing the gradual development of language competencies with the idea that communicative behavior is easily scaled, and I don't think it is. We can scale the range of behavior. That's what the levels A1, A2, etc. do. And we can, to some degree, make distinctions within those levels. But when it comes to the teaching learning situation, I think it's not necessarily the best idea to try to divide up a program according to descriptors. I would divide it up according to the input materials that students are using, or perhaps the particular emphasis that one puts on the different productive activities they're performing.
Thank you, David. I have another question for you. Someone here is asking about grammar, and is it banned from the can-do descriptors?
We have two kinds of descriptors in the CEFR. And in chapter 4 of the 2001 document, we have descriptors that focus on communicative language activities. So reception, interaction, production. Mediation didn't have scales in 2001. It has them now. There is also, however, chapter 5. And what chapter 5 does is offer us scales for communicative language competencies, focusing on grammar and vocabulary and phonology and those kinds of things. So what we have to do when we're concerned to understand what's meant by the progressive levels of the CEFR's descriptive scheme is always read the scales in chapter 4 that focus on activities with the scales in chapter 5 rather, that focus on communicative language competencies. You only fully understand a descriptor at level, for example, A2, for, let's say, listening, if you also understand the scope of the descriptors for grammar and vocabulary and so on in chapter 5. That says nothing, of course, about the role of explicit grammar teaching, but one of the things that the CEFR insists repeatedly is that it is a reference document, it's not a pedagogical manual. Having said that, I should add that the action-oriented approach to the description of language use has the inescapable implication that spontaneous use of the target language plays a central role in successful proficiency development. And in that, of course, it's at one with current theories of second language acquisition.
Thank you, David. I have one here, a comment saying David is not talking, sorry, this is all very interesting, but where's the response to COVID-19? David is talking about in the classroom, but we're not in the classroom. How about some advice on distance learning? Now, I think this was just before you had made the link towards the end there, but perhaps you'd like to elaborate a little bit more on the link to distance learning, David, please.
Well, it seems to me that distance learning will be easier if learners, when they are no longer able to go to the classroom, have the capacity to reflect on their learning as they learn, to identify the learning targets that they are intended to be pursuing, to monitor their learning, and of course to assess the success of their learning efforts.
Thank you, David, and perhaps also
let me just add that I don't think we respond to the challenge of COVID by focusing only on the particular situation that we're in, with in some jurisdictions schools closed and so on. What I was arguing for was a fairly radical redevelopment of language education at all levels of the system, such that by the end of what I was trying to explain, if you take out the assessment by public exams, you're not left floundering. You have still got a robust system which is underpinned by criterion referenced assessment practices.
Thank you, David. And I just wanted to add that, of course, in addition to David's webinar on the resource part of our website under webinars, there is one specifically looking at the use of digital tools to support teachers when they're delivering online classes. Perhaps you would like to take a look at that. Here's just a comment. Self-assessment must make sense for teachers and learners, otherwise nobody uses it. So CEFR descriptors should and could be used, but first they should become integrated into every classroom. How would you react to that comment, David?
I thought that's what I was saying.
It's been reinforced, really, that it needs to be integrated into everyday work practice in the classroom. I'm just checking because the questions are still coming in. Wait till we see if there's any more. I believe that some work has already been done. This is in response to the comment there, but it is fragmented. Yes, I think there's just a recognition that further work is needed. One person then responding saying,
sorry, work is needed on,
so that these using self-assessment becomes integrated.
Yes, yes.
Becomes more integrated in everyday practice.
Yes, absolutely, yes.
Yes. And someone else in relation to that has said, student participation may be one solution to them. Listen to students and build the future with them. They're already born with all the digital skills. So I think that's a wise comment. Begin with the learn and build on what they can already do.
Yes, children and adolescents and adults are usually cleverer and wiser than teachers are inclined to give them credit for.
Sorry. And here's another question, David. How can we achieve a more precise definition of the status of EFL users, and what can be done to make it more clearly recognised in institutional settings? I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Can self and peer assessment, if done on a regular basis, in a sense replace or be assessed summatively? So how do you move from self and peer assessment to summative assessment?
Well, I think that if you are following the kind of self-assessment implied by the ELP and its checklists, you're going to be pursuing a program or a course of teaching and learning in which it's very difficult to distinguish straightforwardly between what is teaching, what is learning, and what is assessment, because these things are constantly bound up with one another in the ongoing dialogic interaction between the teacher and her learners. Some years ago, some colleagues of mine who were pursuing a radical version of language learner autonomy did a study of the results of pupil, this was lower secondary, so student self and peer assessment, where they were negotiating the criteria of assessment with one another and with the teacher, with the teacher's own assessments of the pupils following the criteria that she derived from the curriculum. And there was such a close fit between the reflective assessment-oriented component of the pedagogy and the kind of exam that the teacher was required to implement, that the results were continuous with one another. There was absolutely no serious divergence. It's interesting that one of the things that students involved in ELP pilot projects said was, yeah, I quite like this idea of self-assessment, but who's going to pay any attention? And you don't have to think about this for very long to realize that if self-assessment is to develop as an important part of teaching and learning, of pedagogy, then it must be paid attention. And if I'd had twice the length of time to talk this afternoon, I would have made the point that in alternative assessment, we need to find a place for self-assessment. The reporting of assessment outcomes needs to include the reporting of what learners say about their own achievement.
Thank you. I think we have food for thought for a follow-up webinar, perhaps, David. Here's another comment. I believe that successful autonomous learning starts with a school policy or profile that focuses on self-management in all subjects, not only in languages. What would you say to that suggestion?
I absolutely agree. I mean, my own work, as you explained at the beginning, has focused to a really large extent on this notion of learner autonomy, but specifically in language education. But in language education, learner autonomy is only a particular case of a more general educational phenomenon, which is autonomy and autonomization across the whole spectrum of education. So I entirely agree with whoever put that question. Of course, many language teachers who want to pursue language learner autonomy because they believe that by having their learners take the key decisions, they will achieve better proficiency, often do this against the current of the dominant pedagogical tendencies in their particular institution, which doesn't always make for an easy life.
Thank you very much, David. I think it's been really, really interesting to see the number of questions. And I think what really has happened today is this has been food for thought. We all need to go away and mull over much of what you've said, but it certainly requires a real shift in our thinking. And it's at the level of the whole school, it's the level of policy and practice, and involves school management as well. I hope, listeners, that you found this very helpful. David has kindly agreed to share his slides, so we will send them to everyone who has logged on today. And this will be made available on our YouTube channel very, very soon, so that if there's anyone else you know would like to have taken part today but wasn't able, you can tell them that the recording will be available very soon. So thank you once again, David, and thank you to everyone who took part. And perhaps this is something that we can take further in 2021. It would be very interesting to have your ideas in response to the questions David posed at the end of his presentation. So please, let's keep up the conversation. Email us, send us your ideas, and we'll see how this moves forward in 2021. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye from the ECML. Thank you, David.
Thank you, and goodbye from me.